I'm ready. Good morning. We are live, coming to you from earlier than normal. It is 7 in the morning in Arizona, and I am for 9 in the morning in Chicago, where Casey is, and will be reading you 2 selections in this, our 14th episode of the Non-Existent Story, storytelling story reading game in which 2 stories are presented, one of which is published and does exist, and one of which the reader this week, Casey, has shamelessly made up. I borrowed shamelessly from a previous episode.
Everything's shameless.
Everything is shameless in this podcast.
No shaming on this podcast. Shame-free.
Right. And the additional challenge being that in addition, while trying to guess correctly this week's episode after she presents them, I will be doing it at 7 in the morning, so my brain's not going to be all that great, but we will do our best and see how we get. With that fabulous introduction, Casey.
It's great. I love it. All right. Well, I'll begin. Well, 7 in the morning is like 10 in the morning for an army person, so I didn't feel as bad as I probably should have by making you do this. Shame-free, shameless.
It was my idea. All the worse.
Through unfortunate circumstances, a series of unfortunate events. Okay, so the theme for this week is Atlantis. Are you familiar with Atlantis?
Not all of the academic details of it, but the sunken island and civilization.
Basically, yeah. So the idea is that there was kind of a vast inland continent which was wealthy and powerful and advanced, and it had colonies all over the world. And around the year 500 BC, more or less, there was some sort of cataclysm or flood or tsunami. Some people have associated it with the biblical flood. And it was totally submerged under the waters of the Atlantic. And the first mention is actually by Plato, who refers to it in kind of a tangent of an allegory about some crazy people from the ancient world who attacked ancient Greece. Ancient Greece for him, which was doubly ancient for us.
Ancient squared Greece.
Ancient squared, yes. They invented that too at that moment. But this image of a lost civilization or this submerged world has inspired many stories since, and today I will be presenting 2 of them.
Oh.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Story 1, in chronological order. Okay. For 20 years, the USS Dolphin had been charged with the task of intercepting slave ships in the West Indies, the East Indies, and the Barbary Coast. In 1859, it embarked upon its final voyage, a scientific expedition to sound the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. The expedition was led by Matthew Fontaine Maury and Giovanni Cantelli. Maury, a former naval officer from Virginia, had been gravely injured in a skirmish with pirates. Crippled in body but fortified in spirit, Maury decided to explore those regions of the ocean that no living man had visited. He would make a map of the ocean floor. Cantelli was an Italian physicist, the inventor of a device that transformed images into audio frequency tones, which could then be sent across telephone lines. His interest in building a transatlantic line of communication had incited him to join Maury's expedition. He was also a gifted musician. It was Cantelli's idea to sound the ocean depths with piano wire instead of rope. The piano wire fell straighter and more quickly, and when dropped into a choppy sea, it produced a resonant humming noise not unpleasant to the ear. One morning, when the ship was about 100 leagues south of the Azores and far from any coast, the falling wire stopped abruptly. Further measurements of the vicinity confirmed that the ocean floor lay on average nearly 600 fathoms below them, with the exception of an area some 15 yards in diameter, where the waters were only a little more than 2 fathoms deep. The shallow region formed a perfect circle, and as perfect circles do not exist in nature, Cantelli and Maury were lowered down into a diving bell in order to investigate. And so it was that on August 10th, 1859, they became the first men in 12,000 years to enter the Tower of Oraculum, from whose heights a vanished civilization saw lights from stars that have long since burnt out. Subsequent attempts to relocate the tower have proved fruitless. Some say it is cursed. The Dolphin returned safely to Norfolk, but a year later, Union troops set it ablaze so that it would not fall into Confederate hands. Cantelli's communication device failed, and he died in relative obscurity in his native Florence. Today, he is remembered as the inventor of the fax machine. Maury completed and published his map, the world's first map of ocean bathymetry. Maury's map charts the depths of the area south of the Azores, but makes no reference to any shallow circle. Perhaps he wanted to protect the tower. Perhaps he wanted to forget it. One of his great-nephews would later recall that, in the weeks before his death, old Uncle Maury would mutter incoherently about the towers of Atlantis. So, I will now read the excerpt. And I'm deviating from our now typical source, which is the Free Music Archive, because we're going to listen to underwater whale sounds. And I don't think that you can copyright whales. Or that you should, anyway. Seems
I don't think you should either.
Okay. Can you hear it?
I think I can hear it.
It's very ambient.
Yes, it's very ambient.
How about that?
Yes, I got it.
Yeah? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The diving bell was lowered until it floated just above the hard, smooth surface of the circle, scattering a school of halibut in a burst of bluish silver. It was a cloudy day. Even at this shallow depth, the light was dim. From the glass windows of the diving bell, at first Maury and Cantelli could only make out a green circle around them, pale, almost fluorescent against the darkness of the surrounding deeps, a sunken garden floating over the black abyss. Algae and barnacles covered the surface of the circle. By repeatedly extending and retracing one of the legs of the diving bell, they were able to scrape the algae away, revealing a geometric pattern, like a map of whirlpools, said Maury. Or like a net of interlocking suns, said Cantelli. Mi ripegneva laddove soltacci. Against me coming, pushed me step by step, back to the place where silent is the sun, echoed Maury. As their eyes accustomed to the dim green light, Maury and Cantelli gradually discerned the outline of a circular wall, which was regularly adorned with large purplish rings of some unknown metal. From these rings, bolted to the wall, hung chains of the same metal. The rings showed no signs of rust or decay. Cursed or miraculously preserved from the passage of time, the violet-colored chains repelled the abundant sea life that bubbled and flit around it. We have come to a prison, said Maury, or to their place of exile. Men were chained to these walls. An irregular protuberance rose up from the middle of the circle. As the diving bell approached the center, they made out the outline of a form. The same purplish metal, a triangular shape with another inverted triangle atop it. An hourglass, said Maury. A woman, said Cantelli. And then the clouds broke, rays of sunlight illuminated the circle with a brilliant green light, and through the window of the diving bell they saw with atrocious clarity a leering and sadistic face, eyes aglow, mouth sharp-toothed and smiling, always smiling, eternally victorious. Goodbye, whales.
I love the use of the whales. Although it made me think of the podcast that you'd referred to recently about the man who had sex with animals. I was wondering if you'd met King of the Whale.
Not yet, but they have like 100 and some episodes, so anything is possible. You have to get creative after episode 100.
I think so. But an underwater episode. All right, I think I've got everything.
Okay.
I don't think I have any other questions.
Okay.
Besides my comment.
Okay, the second one is shorter. Let me make sure this is set up. Okay. So moving forward in time. On May 12, 1927, the Atlantic Underwater Railway Tunnel was inaugurated, and the first transatlantic train departed from the Pont de Saint-Mathieu, bound for New York City. The tunnel was designed by the French engineer Adrien Giant, who conceived of the idea while watching a group of children playing with a bamboo cane. The tunnel was built using steel ropes to lower a series of tubes down upon the ocean floor. The tubes were lined with cement and united to each other by iron bolts covered with rubber so that any leakage could be avoided. The tubes were closed at one end only. The open end was connected to the previous segment and pumps used to remove the water. Once the section was completed, the workers inside demolished the metal cap that closed the end of the previous segment, and so the tunnel proceeded. As the first group of workers extended the tunnel along the ocean floor, other workers spread a strong iron net above it to protect it from possible shipwrecked vessels that might sink down upon it and damage it. On the day of the inauguration, shortly after the departure of the world's first underwater train, an explosion shook the tunnel, and most of Jean's work was destroyed. The train remained trapped underwater, but luckily at a point relatively near the coast, where the ocean was more shallow. The passengers managed to save themselves by putting on divers' helmets and walking back to Europe. During their long march home, they stumbled upon the ruins of Atlantis, one of the lost cities founded by the people of Atlantis. It was later discovered that a certain MacRoller, a professional rival of Jean's, as well as a spurned lover of Jean's wife, was responsible for blowing up the tunnel. Fortunately, he was brought to justice. The derailed and sunken train and the remains of the tunnel have since been eroded by the sea. Today, only minor ruins can be visited. The development of the airplane industry soon rendered transatlantic train travel impractical, and the project was never renewed. And for my excerpt, I'm going back to the Free Music Archive for the accompaniment. So this is Good Night by the Knickerbocker Quartet. All that is left of Atlantis today are the ruins, broken or superbly erect columns, destroyed temples which resemble the wreck of a forest blown by a tempest, houses now inhabited by seaweed and fish, places where debris fills the space once occupied by exquisite furniture, wide streets now overgrown by underwater plants cross the city from east to west and from south to north, trailing on into the underwater horizon. But what enhances, above all, the sublime beauty of these ruins is the phosphorescent bluish light that seems to rain upon the city like a shower of stardust, and which gives these ancient places an illusion of life. The light comes from large numbers of medusae and jellyfish that haunt these dark waters. Inside the ruins, thousands of microorganisms also give out a faint light which, combined with that of the medusae and the jellyfish, makes the walls of Atlantis glitter with a strange and eerie movement.
Okay, I got it. Bravo! I very much enjoyed my introduction to more contemporary Atlantis fiction.
It's abundant.
Really? I haven't seen much of it, but I like it.
Well, the big revival was in the 19th century, and there's various stories in the 19th century, and then since then, I think people, especially people who are into like UFOs and mermaids and kind of like paranormal type stuff, are also kind of drawn to Atlantis. But I think there's a movie too, like a Disney movie or something. Or
there is. They made, and it's not bad. I've seen it, although they made a sequel, and I don't think you should watch it. But you should watch the first one.
Okay, Atlantis comes back up and then sinks back down again.
Not exactly, but I don't want to ruin the Disney film plot, so I will let you watch it.
Please don't. I hope that there's a princess.
There is a princess, but moving on to your stories, which I think are probably far more interesting. All right, so Two Tales of Atlantis, and I loved, I guess, because it's all about a sunken underwater ancient city. does lend itself to a lot of really incredible images, which I think that you took advantage of, or you and someone else took advantage of in these two stories. So I don't think that I think that the plots are pretty straightforward. Although the plot in the second story was also pretty original. But let me focus on them one at a time and then compare. So in the first story with the old slave ship of the USS Dolphin, which takes place in 1859, you have the two main characters, or the only real characters that we focus on, the only ones that are given names. And I liked a little comment towards the end about these two sort of scientific explorers. The one from America, when he saw the figure, the small symbol in the center of the disc at the top of the tower, thought of an hourglass, and the Spaniard thought of a woman. And
the Italian,
yes, the Italian thought of a woman, and I thought that was. Yeah, I mean, perhaps feeds into the stereotype, but I thought it was a very clever touch. And I also enjoyed the accompaniment of the whale sounds. I thought it was very haunting. Except towards the end where some man started trying to corral them or something.
That was interrupted by an advertisement, which I had to pause and then mute and then skip while trying to read.
All right.
My Atlantean episode is haunted and cursed by any number of technical difficulties.
Well, I mean, so was Spielberg's Jaws. So there's something about watery stories that just lend themselves to technical error.
Yes, it's true. All Herzog's movies, I think, have also Fitzcarraldo, I think in particular, where he had to like find indigenous people in a jungle and then get them to pull an ocean liner up a mountain. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, but to be focused on later. So these two explorers, though their specialities and purposes are different, but these two explorers find themselves in a predicament where they're sitting on this disc, the top of this tower. I imagine like a flat circular surface.
Yes, it's right. The top of a tower. It's not really a predicament. I mean, they're fairly safe. Mm-hmm. They're in a diving bell, which is basically what it sounds like. It's like a metallic thing that you could sink into water, depending on the point. I mean, we use them today. They can just go like find the Titanic. Like since like the 1500s, I think, or so, it was just like a glass cage that's like it's pressurized. Mm-hmm. So you can like be sunk down into it, I think.
No, I think that was kind of, I like the focus in both about technology from another era. So in the first one in the 1859, and then the second in 1927, the old submarine bells and the idea of a train underwater. These what we think now is kind of bizarre and strange, although, I mean,
well, I think that there's in both, I think, and maybe just the myth of Atlantis in general and stuff. That on the one hand, there's this like sense of otherness, it's almost like an alien life form that existed on Earth. So it has this terrestrial familiarity, but at the same time, it's so remote that it seems alien.
It's highly other. Definitely.
Yeah, it's highly other, but at the same time, and this happens in travel writing too, like people tend to project their own concerns and tensions onto this other as a way of kind of like seeing it from the outside. So I think in both, you kind of see the way in which the Atlantean myth is actually a backdrop or a pretext for fantasies of an individual or like of a society or something. So there's like different tensions that are like at play in their relative societies that in order to dramatize or turn into an adventure tale, they involve Atlantis. And that's true also of like Conan Doyle's story about Atlantis, which it's a very Conan Doyle kind of thing. No Sherlock Holmes, unfortunately. That would have been cool.
Oh, that would have been cool. I just feel like everything, once it's been around long enough, should have an underwater episode. It seems to be the natural progression. But
And
that
space.
aside, yes, but that aside, so the backstory of these two characters and then their purpose, and then it's all the build up to this scene that you've chosen, this excerpt in which they get the image of Atlantis, or what they see of Atlantis, the underwater ruin, which is the top of this tower. And then the excerpt in both stories, they focus on those images.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there were some very kind of interesting, pretty cool details describing the first encounter with the tower. All of the different colors, because what you focus on, I don't know. You focus on the colors that you can see and interpret underwater. And as I already said, I just think that the images lend themselves really well to literature, just because they're so kind of elusive, and everybody's going to have their slightly different interpretation of it. And then water also is such a fluid, and I mean, it was focused on in our last episode.
No.
So
it's obviously, this is inspired very directly from the last. I think we often have these little segues or connecting points, but like it's kind of an irrational space underwater. Boundaries are fluid, and whenever boundaries are fluid and you can't be sure of your perceptions, it's good for it's good for creativity, I think. And there's also a sense of like a heightened subjectivity. So like what two people see, or one person sees, or a group of people with, little underwater helmets see, different from person to person, but also somehow like more creatively constructed or something. Yeah, the underwater images it's like its own thing. I think it would be cool if I could explain the physics of it better. You took a class on the physics of color, so maybe you can explain the physics better.
I try not to remember that class. Mostly because I thought it was going to be an easy way to cop out of a science requirement, and it ended up focusing more on like the biology of the eye and all of these things, which was really quite hard, at least for me. Yes. But yeah, no, it's a super compelling image. Although approached from a different angle in the second story, where the travelers on the underwater train end up dealing with an explosion, and then subsequent. It was actually really funny for me to picture. I pictured they're almost to New York, but still underwater. And instead of trudging up to New York from underneath the water, they're like, screw it, and they walk all the way back to Europe.
they actually. It's they started in France. They were bound for New York City, and then the explosion happened. So they were relatively close to the Brittany coast. So because that would be a several 1,000-mile walk. I mean they do still end up walking like about 100 miles underwater, which is pretty impressive. And there are one imagines more details about how exactly they achieved this incredible feat, because walking underwater is rather difficult. But I mean, it's a more neutral because it's about a group of people and they're not really experts. Although we assume that if they're willing to be like the first people to travel,
they had some safety emergency training. They had stewardesses showing them before they took off.
I know, right? In the event of a terrorist attack. Yeah, well, and also like they would have to be kind of intrepid travelers themselves if they're willing to be under the ocean for so long. Like many people would not be willing to do that. I would probably be one of those people who would not want to be under the ocean for
not on the ocean floor, at least.
Like let them work out the kinks maybe first. A couple of trial runs.
Yeah, well, it was really perfect of you to focus on this, for me at least. Also because I just finished reading Mary Roach's Grunt, which is all about these bizarre, usually angles that people don't think about, components of a soldier that he must deal with in the U.S. Army, like aspects of his wardrobe and what made them important and why. She visits the people who create the uniforms and their textile strength and whether or not they're fire resistant, how, and then genitalia blown off and how the reconstructive surgery works. And then these odd little focuses. But there's one about submarines, so underwater diving training, and then she makes some inferences to different submarine training, and then also, and she references a story from the 1980s about a group of people who were in a pressurized chamber, and for some unknown reason, someone opened it while they were still, it was slowly unpressurizing them, but it was still equivalent to about 300 feet, or 305 feet underwater. And then suddenly it was opened and they exploded from the beds. One of the guys literally was brought to the autopsy in multiple bags.
Wow. Yeah, no, I mean, even at like, I think at like 6 meters, if you're not gradually brought back up at the right speed and like with the right pressure, like nitrogen bubbles form in your bloodstream. And then I don't know what happens when that happens, but it seems like,
I don't know. But the autopsy said that their fat was described as like butter in a pan that had just been.
That's disgusting.
Melted. Right? It's pretty
You
gross.
seem like someone who's been watching 10 hours of Game of Thrones.
I wonder why that would be.
I just get that impression. I watched Eraserhead last night, so we can talk about traumatic, but it's a different kind of disturbing, speaking of dismembered weird bodies, but we'll save that for the end.
We will save that for the end, something for our listeners to look forward to or tune out from. But I bring that all up only because it was added nuance for me as a listener, as these intrepid explorers and scientists in the first story are slowly lowered in this little 1859 chamber. And then as those poor French train travelers drudge their way across the floor of the Atlantic and back to France, I was thinking about the bends. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, no, I would have liked to have included a little bit more about the technicalities of that, but it was hard to find a
source.
Yeah, well, no, it was no, just from the book. Like it was hard to find a paragraph that summarized that, eloquently and quickly. It was kind of dispersed information around the book, let's say.
Yes, let us say that.
Or was it?
And the last thing that I will say, well, perhaps not the last thing. Perhaps it's just a comment. I really loved, and I don't know if this was done deliberately or not, the image of the train ruin. So you have this explosion, and then the all of this contraption that is described pretty thoroughly in the summary is just another ruin in the sea, as these people wander slowly back underwater through the ruin of Atlantis, leaving the modern ruin of the train.
There's a certain circularity to it that have you seen Planet of the Apes?
I saw the original. I saw the old one. I haven't seen the new one.
Okay. Well, for those who are listening and have not yet seen this 1960s classic, you should skip, because Planet of the Apes has this very famous end scene where, Charlton Heston, I think, is traveling, and then he ends up on some planet and it's ruled by apes and it's very cruel and all these things. And in the very last scene, he's, I think he escapes and he's going along the beach, which is now a jungle. It's reverted to savagery. And there's probably some problematic racial connotations in that movie. But he sees up above the cliffs a ruin of the Statue of Liberty, and he realizes that the planet that he has returned to is in fact his own. And there's something I think about any kind of, especially like the underwater Atlantis, like a civilization, and it's kind of seen as at its peak. That's one reason why people find it so especially interesting. It's not just like some huts, this was like a really advanced, like maybe they had electrical wires and the internet, like who knows. But then so you have those ruins of like, a society at its peak, and then right next to it you have the train, so that in another 10,000 years someone could come by and see the ruins of Atlantis and then also see the ruins of the train.
Right.
and not
I
know
love
maybe
that.
if they're the same.
Although I maybe I found more humor or poetry in this image than I did in the original Planet of the Apes. I thought that was always the most depressing scene when he sees the Statue of Liberty lying there half submerged in like sand or water.
Oh yeah, no, it's totally meant to.
It's crushing.
It's impactful. It's like I definitely like it. You know, it's seared into your brain, which is the only part of the movie that I remember with any clarity, apparently. So I mean, some of the apes and things like that. But.
No, I remember that one of his fellow astronauts gets lobotomized by an ape. That was also pretty horrible.
Ah, yeah, I blocked that apparently.
I can see why. That's actually it's a very traumatizing film for me. I'm traumatized by talking apes, but that's just me.
And whereas 10 hours of Game of Thrones is not traumatizing.
Well, in different and more palatable ways, but we're all different. So the only, I think, last thing I will say is that I thought that you having these two particular stories was interesting because I see them in these similarities, and I do love how they play off each other. But I wouldn't necessarily call them the same genre, because the first it came across as fiction, like historical fantasy fiction. So I from that they were slightly different genres, which I thought was kind of cool because they still worked so well together. And way into my trying to guess which one you wrote, although this is quite tricky because there are different hints, which I'm sure you deliberately dropped in both that make me think you could have written either of these stories.
It always feels a little bit like the scene from Princess Bride and the Io cane, where they try. Did I do that on purpose, or did I do it by accident, or did I do it making you think that I did it on purpose?
Really think that, wouldn't you?
But you know that I know that you know that I know.
But we always find ourselves in the position of the very short Sicilian man.
Myself more than you.
While you get to this get to be the chiseled blonde with the mask. But very well.
Much less chiseled later, though. Rest in peace, Carrie Elways.
Yeah. I know.
The hot Carrie Elways. The not hot Carrie Elways continues on. Probably.
Yeah. Well, the same thing happened to Val Kilmer. He used to be so good. Val Kilmer?
Yeah, I know. I kind of receded from my attention. Speaking of Val Kilmer, I want to see the Doors movie. I think he's supposed to be Jim Morrison of the Doors.
I haven't heard about that one.
I've only heard about it, but sounds good. If you like the Doors, which I do.
Moving right along. So in the first story, the incorporation of the Italian scientist from Florence, in the brief translation of what he says in the excerpt, and then to the symbol in the center of the Atlantean ruin as not an hourglass but a woman, and the fact that Maori invented a fax machine all lead me to believe that you could have written the story. These are the details that seem to pop out the most.
The fax machine is what suggests that I wrote the story.
For some reason, that's the impression that I got. However, on the other hand, this story was focused in 1859, and I would see you as drawn more to the time period in the second story of 1927. Because I think that you just like that era more.
I wrote my dissertation on the 20s. So
yes. Also, I know that you have you really enjoy the genre of historical fiction. So history, but with some kind of little twist that makes it more fantastical, but incorporated in a realistic way. And you've spoken about authors who focused on this genre before, and your love for them. So it's something you really like.
I like when Pynchon does it particularly. It's because I'm obsessed with Mason and Dixon. That's why.
Okay, so that is why. That was the main reason I thought that you might have written the second one. but I don't know for sure which one of these you wrote. And I think that this would be a good point if we had listeners that we could have them call in. Right. Or I could it would make it sort of like a what is the show where you have to make a certain guess and you're
Price is Right.
No, and you're trying to get $1 million and you're allowed like a phone call or pull the audience.
Yeah, like the $1 million.
Who wants to be a millionaire?
Yeah, something million.
Who wants to guess the non-existent story? And then I could be like, well, what do you think? Who wants
to be a dollar heir? Like there's no actual, budget here. So who wants to buy me lunch?
We need to think of some kind of incentive. Because I wanna phone a friend.
We'd have to start recording. We'd have to start recording at the same time every week. And that's clearly too much to ask.
That is too much to ask. Damn. So I have to choose. Listeners, which one do you think is a non-existent story? Call me. My number.
This is where I do the Jeopardy, which apparently I can download little sound clips. I would do a Jeopardy sound clip or something right here.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm gonna say. Oh, also because you had the whale sounds in the first one, which was very creative. I think the time period music for the second one worked really well, as did the whale sounds for the first. Helpful, and then I realized that it's not at all helpful. I'm gonna say because all of the. I'm going to do something that I don't normally do and say that there seemed to be too many details in the first story to hint that it was something that you would write versus the second story. I'm going to say that you wrote the second story.
Pause.
That's my guess.
I actually read the first story.
God damn it.
And a fun fact, I have not been able to read the second story because, all right, so the second story is titled Il Tunnel Sottomarino, the subterranean tunnel, or I'm sorry, submarine tunnel, the underwater tunnel. And it is by Luigi Matta. It was, it's, a 1920s adventure story. I came across it in this fantastic book that, if you don't own, I will just probably buy for you, called The Dictionary of Imaginary Places.
And you should. I have the Devil's Dictionary, but I like collecting bizarre dictionaries, so I definitely would appreciate
This is a good one. This is a good one because you can look up, like, it has a lot of Lord of the Rings stuff, but then it has a lot of other things that you've never heard of, and it has multiple entries on Atlantis. So I wasn't sure if I was going to tell you about it or just use it as like an endless source of obscure. But then they would always be like kind of a sci-fi fantasy tilt, so I decided not to. But yeah, so what happened is but I couldn't get the novel. Like I was like, well, even if I find it in Italian, at least I can like kind of figure out an excerpt and then have like a longer excerpt, because this excerpt is super short. And it's super short because there were two entries, in the Dictionary of Imaginary Places. And one of them kind of described the plot, and then the other one described the city Atlantasia. But because it's, they're dictionary entries, and so they're quite, they're eloquent and they're really funny at times, and quite poetic. So, but yeah, that's why it's so short. So I don't know I don't know a lot of what happened in the story because basically everything I presented is all I know. So it was basically it's two excerpts, but one is just less excerpty than the other one.
Gotcha.
And that's why there's fewer details. I tend to go long generally. That's one of my issues. I actually had to cut this one down a lot, and it's still too long.
No, but the shorter ones are. I think that the shorter ones are more challenging because they're still quite good and they capture everything if you do it correctly, which you did.
Well, which
the guests are a little less to go on.
Yeah, it does give you fewer clues. But yeah, in this case, it was his name is Alberto Mangel, and he's from Buenos Aires, but he's lived abroad most of his life. I think in Canada and then in Europe. He's like super meta cultured expat. But when he was like an adolescent, his first job was in a library reading to Borges. That was his job. And he's very Borgesian. Like I know, right? Like, what was my first job? Like,
I want it to be my first job. My first job, I shelved books in a library, but I never got a chance to read. I just got followed around by creepy people who go to the library to watch porn on the computers. Yes, this is the public library now.
Yes. Well, it is anyway, that's another topic that we can get into.
Another topic. That's another one.
But yeah, so Il Tono del Sottomarino, and then obviously the first one I debated. I wanted it to be and they had to kind of do something similar, which is kind of stumble across Atlantis, and I wanted it to have some sort of reflection of like current events. So the original idea that I had was to situate it afterwards in 1957, and it was going to be the same year that Sputnik was launched, and the first man in space and first spaceship and all that kind of stuff. So have this kind of like polarization between like Star Wars and Soviet intrigue and conspiracy and geopolitics.
It was in 1959.
No, this is the one that I was going to write.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that was the first idea, but I
decided to take it back 100 years.
Yeah, I decided to take it back to see if that would throw you off, because a lot of times the more natural thing is to read something older and then do a more modern retake of that. So you've thrown me off with this before. You did this with the egg one.
Oh, yeah.
That was a good one. But yeah, so I think that, I kind of wanted to do more with like the music aspect and the piano wire. Like all that's true. Like, so when they would, like this map by Maori, well, it's actually from 1853. But it was the first map of like how deep the oceans are. And you basically, they use like a rope and lead, and they just dropped it at various points. And
what
then
if it
later
landed on a whale or something and this started moving away?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why it's... I know, right? It was pulled along. Like the Kraken pulls them into, the stratosphere.
The Kraken. No, I love that detail.
But the piano wire was a real thing, although it came about a little later. Then there's these various devices, and then there's diving bells, and then I was going to play out more the aural component and have them like discover like musical instruments or like some sort of more like musical thing. And I was just really interested in, the fax machine was invented before the telephone, and that's how it works. It just translates image into sound, which I think is like kind of an elegant thing to do, which I don't usually think of when I think
of. It doesn't sound elegant though.
The fax machines
sound awful. It's not an elegant machine.
But that's what your image sounds like. But that's because usually people, fax uninteresting things.
I bet if you fax something beautiful, then it would sound prettier over the fax machine.
It would sound like a harp. But so that, and then the other thing that I was going for in the first one was there was like the little reference to the ship intersecting slave ships, and then like the Civil War. So I wanted to have this kind of reflected sense of like bondage or human slavery or something like that suggested underwater as like a
So, I didn't even make that connection. One kind of advanced yet inhumanly barbaric nation.
It's hard to do good. Yeah, I'm wondering if we should actually start sending these to the other person a day before,
so we can have a more developed sense of response. Yeah, I've thought about that too.
Yeah, and like have some questions.
Your impression about a story is going to change when you hear it versus when you see it. Because there's how a story sounds, but then there's writing styles there's some things that come across better when you read them. I think that would be more challenging, and then of course we'd have to resist cheating and looking it up.
Yeah, that is the thing, and then it would make, I think, for a better. Well, I mean, you do a very good job, I think, but it could make for a more structured and interesting discussion. But I think it would become much easier to guess who wrote which.
Yes, it would.
So that's why I'm of two minds.
I do like that we're hearing about it at the same time as all 4 of our listeners are hearing about it.
I know it. I would love
it's a surprise for us all.
For us both.
I don't know. It is a conundrum, isn't it? The conundrum of the non-existent story.
Yes. How existent should it be? But yeah, there's like I don't know, the Atlantis thing. I've always found a little bit interesting, and I think the Arthur Conan Doyle one is the one that like really revived it. And basically, it's like a scientist. It's like the Professor Makarot or something like that, and he goes down, and it's in that story, which I've read about in summary form from my Dictionary of Imaginary Places. He goes down and a diving bell, and it's a protected little part of Atlantis that still exists, that survived. And so it's kind of in this insulated underwater cave, square, pressurized structure of some kind. And they're still there, the Atlantean people, and they still have the Greek slaves, and they worship Baal and Moloch, and they do a lot of like really dark, sinister things.
This sounds more like the Disney version of Atlantis.
Yeah, I'm sure that the Disney version was probably based on, because I mean, I love adventure stories too, and it's definitely like an adventure story. But you know, Conan Doyle was really interested in like the occult and dark forces and ghosts and things like that, as we might remember
as we've discussed before in our mysticism.
So there's that one. But then now that like you can go and there's like a National Geographic on like Stone Age Atlantis and people like trying to actually find it. And there's all kinds of theories about where it might have been. One of them is that it was the Azores or nearby, but like some people have said Antarctica because of like Plato's references, because it's on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar. People thought it was relatively close to there. But then other people have said, you know, other locations. So anything's possible. I think there was something.
Where is it that the Mormons believe that the Garden Eve was in? Jackson,
Missouri. No, it's Jackson County, Mississippi, I think.
Jackson County, Mississippi.
I believe.
I bet that Atlantis is there as well. That's my guess.
No, but I mean, there. I think one of the theories is that, like, you know, human civilization might go further back than we think. It's just much, you know, a lot of evidence gets destroyed. So, and it is interesting that it's referenced in Plato as like an ancient. I think it's something like, he says the ancient Greeks were like one of the few civilizations that were able to fend off the attacks of Atlantis. So I think there was something, like it all has to come from somewhere, but I'm just not sure.
Yeah, but then think how sophisticated is ancient Greece thinking about, how sophisticated is ancient Greece squared, really?
Well, that is the question, right? Well,
so I'm picturing really like a couple huts, and then they really didn't like their neighbors who had a couple huts. And the myth of Atlantis was born.
That could also be a possibility. There's another story that is like early. I think it's 1919. It's a French story, and I think they discover, and they also discover an Atlantis that's still like existing, but in some way. But they discover it in the Sahara. So in the Sahara, that's where it's no longer underwater. I mean, it never was underwater. That's how it existed. So one of the vestiges or remnants that was left was in the Sahara Desert. And they discovered this people where the women invite them in. This book is full of like these matriarchal horrors, like man's terror of women ruling is all over that dictionary. And so like they like have sex with these men, and then they dip them in some sort of like silver saline solution or something so that they're all drawn out, and then there's like statues of like these silver petrified men all around the woman's like, you know, royal chambers or something. And there's still spaces left.
Ooh.
So yes.
It's like the image of the ancient Greek sci-fi, the woman trees who the sailors copulate with and then are forever attached to at their nether regions.
Oh yes, there's from Lucien of Samosata, a true history.
Mm-hmm. It's a very true history.
That, or I mean, there's all kinds of feminine punishment. The Amazonian women are also very abundant in it, but it's cool because it's actually not really a dictionary. It's a guidebook, so it's presented as like a Lonely Planet kind of entry. Like, if you go here, here's how you get here. Here's what you would find. Here's how you might be received. Here's what you should check out. Like, it has these little touches as if you could go visit any of these places.
That's so cool. Yeah, I definitely want to read that. I like dictionaries of all manners, and I want that.
I'll send you the link. But also for any listeners, it's the Dictionary of Imaginary Places by Alberto Mangel and Giuseppe Guadalupe or something like that. He worked with an Italian. I don't remember his name.
Well, the final question then. Well, actually, two final questions. First, so what is the score now? Am I still up 1?
I think you're up 1 now.
Up 1.
I think
my lead is vanishing. I am afraid.
I know, right? Your pressure's on, and we're also switching to less frequent, I think.
Right. So starting.
Broadcasts.
So the next episode will be week after next. My turn.
Yeah, I think as we said, starting in September, every 2 weeks.
Okay. So let me pull up my very busy calendar real quick because I'm super organized. I don't even know. So September, if it's next Thursday, it'll be September 15th.
Okay. Does that work for you?
I'm one would hope, but I could be doing anything. I could be drinking coffee. I could be having a bad hair day. So I'll let you know.
I'm sorry. I would love to, but I'll be drinking coffee at that time.
I have to fold laundry right now. I can't.
Well, you realize we've both at this point written a collection of short stories. We've each written 7 short stories. We could start publishing this stuff, which was also kind of part of the scheme.
Right, or even taking one and developing it further.
Yes.
I mean, so that's a question. Up until this point, perhaps I should ask you off air, so we'll keep other people guessing. My last question for on air for our listeners will be: have you made a title for your short story?
Oh yeah, for the first one, I think I was. Because I was gonna play up if I wrote a longer version of this, I'd want to do more with sound and the piano wire and stuff because I really like that detail. And originally it was gonna be the finest Viennese piano wire and things like that. So because that was the place where I love Wikipedia so much.
Yes, and then you could also play with how sound travels underwater and
yes, and so do more with like the oral components. Although then again, that was the part that was most suitable for the podcast as opposed maybe to the written form. But I was going to call it depth sounding. So that was one option. But then the other one, so the line that Cantelli quotes is from, and he was Italian. So I was like, well, he should quote something from Dante because he's Italian. So I looked up the Divine Comedy online, and I just word searched sun because I wanted him to say something about suns. And like the second hit was this like great line, which is, back to the place where silent is the sun. Too, I think it's much shorter in Italian, interestingly, but I was gonna do something maybe like the silent sun, or where silent is the sun, something like that. It's very Eliot. T.S. Eliot would always quote an epigram, and just citing Dante is all the rage.
Well, I mean, it would be, wouldn't it?
How could it not be?
Dante's Inferno?
Yeah, it's actually from like the opening, the first canto, I think. So he hasn't even gotten to the Inferno yet. He's just like walking along and encountering leopards and Virgil and stuff.
Because I think that's one of the ones that I started to read and never finished, like Plato's Republic.
No, I've never read all of it. I've read like little excerpts, but I even bought like a beautiful, because you need like an annotated edition, and I bought a really beautiful one in English that's the definitive edition, and then I bought a less definitive kind of second-rate one in Spanish because I was like, well, it might also read better in Spanish because they're Romance languages. So I have 2 language editions that I could read, but have I? Like, when is the time? When is the time to read the Divine
When is the
Comedy?
appropriate time to read Dante's Inferno? Probably in October. It could be your Halloween project. By Halloween, you will read Dante's Inferno. Or by Lent, by some Catholic holiday.
During Holy Week.
If only we knew when those things were. You could have read it in Spain. That would have been super appropriate.
I know. Maybe or Italy. Maybe next time I go to Florence.
But I think that we're wandering.
Yes.
Albeit on
Okay.
very
So
fascinating
yes,
topics.
now we've wanted. Well, it was somewhat related. All right. So thank you, listeners, for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with musical intros and outros. And Hannah, always something to look forward to.
Yes, I will be pioneering the new, advanced and upgraded, highly technical, super impressive revitalization of the non-existent story.
Yes. Wham bam, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, just like that.
And happy Labor Day.